So this tutorial is going to take you through the process of taking an existing sketch or perhaps a paper pattern that you already have on hand of a stained glass pattern and allow you to turn it into something that is digitally vectorized and is endlessly scalable, allows you to change that gap size between your pattern to make it any size that you want, to constantly be able to adjust it no matter the size or type of glass that you would be using for it, and also gives you the ability to do things like live renderings and simulations of glasses and patinas. So this is going to be that process from start all the way to finish, and will also allow you to take those finished pieces, if desired, and send them to a cutting machine like a Cricut or a Silhouette so that you can use this perfectly trued up pattern that we've created in this digital software to make a really, really clean, accurate stained glass pattern. So here is going to be that process from start to finish. So when we open Illustrator, it's going to ask us to create a new file, and it's going to ask us what size we want. The reality is that it really doesn't matter what file size we choose because it will always scale dynamically and we can always change it later. So 1000 by 1000 pixels is absolutely fine to start with. So we're going to go ahead and create this file. So from here, the first thing that you're going to want to do is, if you have a sketch or a pattern that you're working from, you're going to want to bring that pattern into Illustrator. So for me, I have a sketch that I made in Procreate, and that's what I'm going to bring in here to do my tracing over. So I'm going to go up to File, and I'm going to choose Place because I am placing an image into this document. Here's my sketch. And I'm going to drop it in. So at first you're going to see it's way bigger than the size that I chose, 1000 by 1000, which is totally fine. We're just going to shrink this down. So grab your anchor on the side and press Shift so that it stays uniform. Otherwise it might get a little warped. So now we've got our pattern in the center of the frame. So it's ready for us to be able to trace over the top of it. So if you come over to your layers panel, and if you're missing any panels for whatever reason, you can always go ahead and choose them here. So the layers panel is checkmarked, which means it is visible. If you expand this open, you'll see that right now I just have this one image that I've placed in there and nothing else. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new layer so that this kind of lives on its own and doesn't get obstructed by anything else. And I'm going to double click on it, and it's going to give me the option to use it as a template. So what this does is it automatically dims it down to 50%, and it's going to lock it so that I can't touch it, which is what we want. It can be really frustrating when you're working over top of a file and your picture keeps moving. We definitely don't want that to happen. So now you can see that layer 1, which is where my image is, where I'm tracing over the top, is locked, and it dimming to 50% makes it a little easier for us to trace it. So once your pattern is ready to be traced, there are really only a few tools that we're going to use to do this work. There are a lot of tools that Illustrator has natively built into it. It's an extremely powerful program, but we're only going to be working with a select few of those. Now, the first thing to know is that if you are used to working with paintbrushes or other things from rasterized programs such as Photoshop or Procreate, Illustrator uses what's called vector, which works in a series of points and lines as opposed to brush strokes. So this is what makes it dynamic. It's what makes it so that we can endlessly adjust that pattern to any size we want in the future. But it does mean that it takes a little bit of time to get used to that language if you're not used to speaking it. So for me, in general, I try to work from the largest shapes in a pattern down to the smallest shapes in a pattern. So for this one, we can see that this large pill shape is the largest part of this pattern. So there's a few ways that we could achieve this. It's important for us to look at what the pattern is actually made of. So we can see here that it's made of a semicircle at the top, straight lines on the sides, and a semicircle at the bottom. If we just start going and trying to trace this out, piece by piece, we're probably going to end up with something that's a little bit asymmetrical at the end, which is what we don't want to do. When we work in something like Illustrator in a vectorized program, we have the ability to make absolutely perfectly symmetrical patterns, and we want to use that to our advantage. So if you come over here, this will give us a couple of pre-built shapes to work with. If you choose the ellipse tool or a rotate tool, you'll see right now it says, oh, you can't draw because I'm still on my locked layer, so I need to move up to my other layer. If I pull this out in a circle, you'll see that it's going to draw me a circle shape. If I hit the shift key, it will make a perfect circle. And you can see that at the top of the frame here, that is about what the shape is that we have. If I want to be able to see through it, I just need to make sure that this is transparent instead. So if I continue holding the shift key when I'm readjusting this, you can see that the top of the shape is a circle and the bottom of the shape is a circle. And then there are straight lines connecting them. So I can do that if I want to. I can take a circle here. Let's copy that circle and paste that circle. And I can line them up. The little line that's showing up in the center here shows that those circles are perfectly aligned with each other, which is exactly what we want. So those two circles we know are perfectly spaced with one another. So something that's really important to note is if I look at this circle itself, and I'm going to just for right now turn off this layer so we can just look at the circles, you'll see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4 points that are called out on this circle. And they're not just showing us where the edges of the circle are. This is the mathematical information that Illustrator is using to understand the actual shape of that ellipse. So what we have the ability to do is the two select buttons up here are for me to select a whole shape at once, which is on the left-hand side, or select information about a shape, which is the one on the right-hand side. So when I look here, we can see that there's a little bit more information about this shape, but more so what it allows me to do is I can click this part of the shape and say, I no longer want that piece of information. So since the mathematical information that was attached to this side of the shape is gone, the only thing that's left is where the next pieces of information started. And that's perfect because we are going to put straight lines from side to side here. So that is exactly what we want. If we go back to our full selection tool, you can see here this is the difference between selection and direct selection. So I like to think of it as full object versus piece. If I switch back over to my direct selection, and again, I click this point and I do not want it anymore, backspace, and now it is gone. So now we can see if we look back at our original shape, that's pretty similar to what we want at the top there. And it's important to know that what you want to achieve when you're doing your Illustrator patterns is you want to lean into knowing that the computer did something perfectly as opposed to trying to trace exactly over a sketch. Oftentimes the sketch is not going to be perfect. So you can see that here, these lines are a little bit bigger. This one doesn't quite reach the bottom. That is totally fine. We are just using the sketch as a frame of reference. So now I need to connect these two pieces together. There are a number of ways that you can do this in Illustrator, but the most basic, simple way is I want to take one line and I want to connect this anchor point to this anchor point. So far we've used the big object selection tool, the direct selection tool for individual pieces. We made our circles with this polygon shaper tool. We chose the ellipse tool. And now the last real tool that we're going to use a lot of is the line segment tool. And so just as it states, the line segment tool makes straight lines from one point to another point. You can see that the only option I have is a straight line. I can't make anything curved or anything like that because I can only go from one point to another point. Later, I can change the mathematical information about this line to give it curves and dimensions if I want to, but it will always start out as just one straight line from a point to another point, which works perfect for most of our stained glass pattern design. So again, we're going to grab straight line, and you want to see pieces light up from place to place. So if you see it says anchor or the other piece lights up, that lets us know that those pieces are all attached to one another. So if I zoom in really close on this, you can see that these are now one continuous line. There isn't a break between them, and that's exactly what we want. So now we have our basic shape. We have created the pill that this is going to sit inside of. So we have our shape now, top, side, side, bottom. But what we really want is we want one solid shape all together. So a simple way that you can take one line and attach it to another line is we're talking about specific pieces of information, this piece to this piece. And what we want to do is we want to join the lines together. So we can use the command to join. Object, path, join. So now these pieces are a single shape altogether. If we go back to our big shape tool, now you can see that this shape comes all the way over to the other side. If we grab the whole thing all at once, object, path, join, now it is one single shape. So you can start from the beginning by just doing object, path, join once you have all of your pieces together. What's really important though is that if any of your pieces don't actually join with one another, like there's a gap in between the lines, Illustrator's not going to know how to join those pieces. So make sure that when you're drawing, you have them all attached to one another. So if we look inside of our layer now, we can see that we just have one single path, and that is perfect. So if we come back here, we moved it around a little bit, but that's fine. We'll get it back in place. Nudge that down a little. So now our pill shape is ready to contain the rest of our pieces. So here is where you start making some decisions about how you want your pattern to work. And it can be a little tricky if you have not used Illustrator before to understand what will and will not work. Now, I will say that there is something called a brush tool inside of Illustrator. It exists right here, and it is a paintbrush tool that if you draw with it, will create vectored paths in a paintbrush shape. I do not recommend using this when you are making stained glass patterns, because as you can see, the shape is not smooth, it's not symmetrical. It has not really gained us anything beyond the original drawing, except that it is vectored. Yes, vector is very important, and I think it's a really key part of this process. But what really makes this process important and lends itself to a large amount of success in your project is that the pattern itself is very trued up. It looks very professional. It looks really nice. It scales really well because you know that all those pieces are symmetrical. They're all well-defined shapes. So I do not recommend using the paintbrush method. So we're going to go ahead and delete that shape because we don't want that in there. Instead, we really want to think about building things as individual pieces. Something that's really important to keep in mind about what a stained glass pattern actually is we are really not concerned with the shape of individual pieces. We're concerned about where one piece of glass breaks off and becomes another piece of glass. One very, very, very thin line is the only thing that we are actually interested in. So that's the only thing that we are worrying about. Right now, you can see that the line that we've drawn is a lot thinner than the original line, and that is totally fine. I have the ability to change the width of this line at any time. So I can make it much, much thicker, or I can make it much, much thinner. And we're going to leave it at about 1 point right now, just so that it's not too in our way or anything like that. But we're not going to worry about the actual size of the line. We want to dissect the shape of the line. So if I look at this pattern, it's a very simple, I think 11-piece pattern. And most of these are very basic shapes. Obviously the sun here is going to be, it's part of a full circle. So we'll use a full circle when we create it rather than trying to make a perfect arch. We'll use a full circle and I'll show you how to do that. The rays of the sun are perfectly straight lines. That part is easy. And then the hills and the river have curves in those lines. So before, I said that when we create lines with a line segment tool, we can only really create from one end to the other. However, if we click in, we can see that while we only have 2 points here, there's really nothing stopping us from giving this more information. We just need another tool to allow us to do that. So there is a tool called the curvature pen tool. So the curvature pen tool will allow us to take something of a line and we can add curvature to it. So from here, we can pull this down or we can pull this up and we can move it any direction that we want. But you can see that the curvature really only goes one way. I can't make a wave with the curvature pen tool, but if I take an anchor point or a handle, now I can make a wave. So there are a couple of options that you can use to help you create these shapes. And playing with the handles, which is this line over here, and moving the anchors themselves will give you an idea of how you can create these really dynamic shapes. And what's fantastic about this is that I never have to worry about drawing perfectly smooth curves. The computer will always do it for me. So if you see here, we're kind of getting a shape similar to what it was that we wanted, right? So if we pick this up and drop it on top of the path, and you can see that path highlighted, and we do the same thing here. It's getting a little wonky, but that's okay. Now, if we take our handles and we adjust them, you're going to see that we can start to get pretty close to what that shape is. And it might take some time to get used to it. If you notice, the closer the handle is to the original point, the less dramatic of a curve you'll see. And again, it's not so concerning that I perfectly match my drawing. It's mostly important for me to know that what the computer has drawn, I know to be smooth. So again, if we turn this off, I can see I have a really nice smooth curve from one side to the other. Now, something that becomes really apparent when you start working in a program like this is it gives you a visual indication of the math that is taking place here. So if I actually wanted a perfect hill curve that was, somewhat symmetrical on both sides, I would want to make sure that these handles were perpendicular to one another. And that would give me this perfect smooth hill. If that's something I want, I can make that choice in the pattern. If that's something I don't want, I can go ahead and put it back to the way it was. I'm going to leave it for right now and come back and decide if I really like it later, because the great thing is I can always make that change again. So for right now, we've got our pill and then we've added one shape. I am not going to join this shape to the outside because I want to treat them as individual units. And so the outside is its own unit, and now we're building the units on the inside. So I'm not going to join those shapes together yet. I'm just going to keep drawing. So I'm going to come back and I'm going to make another line. So I've chosen the line segment tool again. And I want to start on the path. Whoop. And I'm going to drag it. Don't worry about it being a straight line for right now, but I'm going to drag it and I'm going to end it where it joins that path. And I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here. So, like we said before, we can go ahead and make changes to this line that will give it the ability to be more dynamic. So if we switch back to curvature pen, which you can find here underneath of the pen tool options, and I pull this up a little bit here, if I want to get the other curve down here, if I grab it again, it's just going to pull it the other direction. So that's not what I want. But if I put it on one side and then grab the handle, now I can start adjusting and going the other direction. So if I come back and forth, and there are many, many ways that you can achieve different shapes like this, but these ones are pretty foolproof and they're pretty reliable. So once again, I'm going to go ahead and turn this off. And again, you can see that if I want to make this absolutely perfect, I can come back to my direct selection and I could make these perpendicular, perfect straight lines. So now I have a really smooth curve going one way and another very pleasing symmetrical type line going the other way. It's not actually symmetrical from one side to the other, but up and down, mathematically, the way that this curve is built is symmetrical flipping over the horizon line, which is a very pleasing thing to the eye. And again, it doesn't quite match my pattern underneath. That is totally fine. We don't have any issue with that. The last of our double curved lines is down here in the river. So let's go ahead and do the same thing again. I'm going to start at one point, drag it about to where that other point would be. And now, since I kind of veered from my path a little bit, I'll just have to keep that in mind as I'm going. That like, oh, I might have to change this up a little bit. And that's totally fine. Switching back to mess with my anchor points. And I'm going to give a little curve here. Let's pull this one out. There we go. That'll give us a little bit more dramatic of a curve. That looks pretty good. And I'm okay with these ones. As you can see, the lines aren't perpendicular, but I'm okay with that because whereas the hills we would expect to be perpendicular with a horizon line, a river doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So these being at a nice slant is nice. What will help too is if you want the river itself to feel like it has good symmetry with itself, is to keep these lines parallel with one another. So now you can see they're kind of traveling on the same angle. So it's a little variation from what I drew originally, but overall pretty good. We're going to do our last piece of the river here. Switch back to the line segment tool and connect from here over to here. Again, we want to make sure that it lights up red so that we know we're attaching it to the path. And add just a bit more curvature in here. Pull up this handle. Let's see, I think we got to pull this one out further. There we go. You can kind of play back and forth. And you can go ahead and turn off your original one to see, you know, do I need to add more curve in this river? I feel like maybe it needs, like it's curving up, whoop, like that. And then if I decide, actually, I think I want it to be a little wider at the bottom, or I want it to be a little bit narrower. Either of those options work, and it will retain that really nice curve as you go. So I think that looks pretty good. So if we pull back out, you can see that we've kind of deviated from that original shape, but overall, I'm really pleased with how this looks now. I think that looks pretty good. All right, so we're at the point now where the bottom half of our pattern is finished. We've got the hills and our river, and it's sitting inside of our little pill. If we turn that off, we can see that those are nice and perpendicular with the horizon line. And now all that we're missing is the sun. So inside of the pattern, the sun is only slightly visible behind the hills, but when we create the detailing for the sun and that part of the pattern, we actually want to create it as if it was a standalone piece that we then just cover with other parts of the pattern. If we were tempted to say, well, this is just a curve, I can take my line segment tool and draw a line from here to here, and then I can use my same tool before to add a curve to it, but then it's not really the side of a circle, and since it's not a perfect quarter of a circle, it's a little bit more, it's hard to tell. And if we go through that process and we end up with something that isn't actually the part of a circle that we would be expecting to see, our brain is going to have trouble believing that part of the pattern. So we really want to make sure that we are actually drawing a circle that we are then just hiding behind the other parts of the objects, in theory. So for right now, let's go ahead and turn off these other pieces. And we're really just going to deal with the sun itself. I'm not even going to worry about the bounds of the sun catcher for right now. So I'm going to go ahead and pull my ellipse tool again. And I'm going to make a perfect circle by holding the shift key. And we're going to get this lined up pretty good. Just like that. So there, we know now from here to here, when we eventually hide the sun behind the hills, and we'll talk about how we're going to do that, I know that this is in fact the part of a circle that I would be expecting to see. My brain is going to believe that that is the case. Now, you can really tell here, if we're looking at the beams, we really don't have a good believability here, right? They're almost kind of leaning off to one side. This big gap over here doesn't really match the one on the other side. And I knew that when I drew this originally in Procreate, I was just trying to get a general idea of about how many lines and spaces I was going to want, but I knew that it wasn't going to be perfect, and I was going to be able to do that instead in Illustrator. So if we take a look here, I am probably going to want at least one perfectly straight up and down line. I think I attempted to do this one as a perfectly straight up and down line. So if I come back to my line segment tool, and really what I want to do is I want to make sure that this line is centered over the center of the circle, because now I can see where that actually would be. If I grab my tool and I hover, it will show me where the center of the circle is because I have it selected. If I click, hold the shift key and drag down, now I can meet up with that circle. And if I really do zoom in here, I can see that I have intersected with the circle. And that's perfect. That's what we want to do, right? We want to make sure that we are really joining our lines in very specific ways and places. Now, I could go through the process of copying this line and turning it sideways, and I would have to do a lot of math and hopefully have that all figured out. But I don't have to do that because, like we said, Illustrator builds all of its information off of mathematical equations. And the rays of a sun radiating from a circle is a very clear mathematical piece of information. So there is a built-in tool that will do this for us. So what we want to do is we want to repeat this line radially around the circle. So we would go to Object, Repeat, Radial. So now we can see that it's radiating in a circle. And what you can see is happening here is that the center of this repeat isn't lining up with the center of the circle. So we're going to go ahead and line it up so it is actually centered. So now all of these pieces are coming off at the same distance. It's okay that they don't line up to the actual edge of the circle. That's not a problem. We'll go ahead and fix that later. But for now, we just want to make sure that the radial is lined up with that circle. So there are 3 pieces of information that you can edit when you're in this radial repeat menu. And one of them is going to be the overall size. So you can use the handle on the side to change that. This one right here is going to change how many instances of the repeat there are. So if you drag it down, you'll get less instances. And if I scoot this over here, you can see that it numbers out how many instances there are. 10, 11, 12, as many as we want. If we look and see about how many instances fit with our plane back here, this is 15 instances, which gives us a straight line and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and a little sliver of a piece. I think those are a little too small on this side. I think overall it's a little bit too big. So I want to make it up to, let's try 16 instances. So this would give us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And that's pretty good. That one has a little sliver, which is a little odd, but what we can do is we can make this a little bit easier for us to see. So the last piece of information that's down here at the bottom is going to show us which of the instances we can see and which we can't see. I think what's going to help us for starters is if we rotate this whole grid, it's going to make it so that it's better aligned with what we're truly seeing. So we're not getting a little overwhelmed with how much information is there. You can choose if you really do want a perfectly straight line coming from the center of the circle going up to the top. I actually don't think that that is something that I want in this pattern because I placed the sun slightly over to the left-hand side. So I think I would rather have there not be that piece of information there. So I'm going to have this come down so that it doesn't intersect. So I don't have like this teeny tiny sliver of glass that I'm going to need to make. Instead, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there's a small piece over here, but it feels a little bit more balanced. So I can scoot this over even a little bit more. And I think that gets me pretty close now. And you can actually see that the centers of these lines are actually really close to what I estimated. It's just that the radial direction was off when I did it the first time. All right, so we're at the point now where we are ready to expand these pieces and make it into its finished shape. So if we go ahead and select everything, you'll notice that it's highlighted most of this in red, but left out the radials. And that's because it's still treating this radial repeat like a working dialogue. It's still going to let us edit things and make changes, but we are good at this point. We don't need to make any more changes. So we're going to go to Object and Expand. And the prompts that it gives you, for the most part, you can go ahead and trust what it's giving you. Press OK. It's all right if you don't fully understand what they mean. It's usually going to give you what you need when you're done. So we're going to press OK. And now you can see that we just have what's left over are the individual line segments. It has them all grouped together because it knows it came from the same dialogue. You can either leave them grouped if that works for you, or if you need to separate them, you can ungroup those pieces. So now if we select everything, we do in fact have all of our pieces selected. And you can see all of those individual pieces down here at the bottom. So what we need to do is we need to get rid of the line segments that are not going to be a part of our piece. Especially down here, we have a lot of overlapping pieces that really it should just be one piece of a hill, another piece, and then the river. It is very tempting at this point to treat this as a bunch of individual pieces of glass because that is how we will eventually be done with the project. However, that isn't how we want to treat creating the vector pattern for it. The only thing that we want to do is we want to understand the difference between where one piece of glass ends and the next piece of glass begins. So we really just want to be getting rid of lines that we don't need, not filling in shapes. And those feel like they're almost the same thing, but trust me that they have very different purposes inside of a program like this. So to get rid of a line, there are two ways that you can go about doing it. And some of them will work in some instances and some of them will not. If you have lines that are just on the outside of a shape and they really aren't interacting with anything else, the easiest way to get rid of them is to come into the Shape Builder tool. And when you're normally on a piece, it's got like a little plus sign next to the cursor. If we click Alt or Option, it will turn into a minus sign. And if we hover over these pieces, it will delete them based on where they intersect. So the next natural idea would be to say, oh, I need to delete some of these sun pieces. And you'll come in here and say like, oh, I need to delete this and delete that and put that together. But what you see now is that we've actually created individual shapes instead of just breaking apart lines. And again, those feel like they're the same thing, but they are not the same thing. So that's not the method we want to go about for getting rid of these interior shapes. It works great for exterior shapes because there's nothing to build shape-wise on the outside. It's just getting rid of the excess. But on the inside, we're going to have to take a slightly different approach. So let's start with the sun. So we know at this point we are good with the shape of the hills. We like the way that they look. And we're going to pop in here. And what we need to do is we need to take the path of the sun and we need to stop it where it intersects with the path of the hill. Now, the very easiest way to do this is to come up to this drop down that had pen tool, anchor point tool, which is what we were doing a lot of our curvatures on. And we're going to go to add anchor point tool. And what this allows us to do is with the sun selected, it's highlighted in red right now. You can zoom in if you need to. We're going to hover over until it says intersect, which means that is the exact point where the sun and the hill intersect. And we're going to click. So now what this has done is it has put a point right where those two lines meet. And we want that to be the case because when we get rid of extra information from the circle, we want to make sure that it keeps right where those two pieces join together. So now if we come over to the other side, whoop, too far, and do the exact same thing, we still have our little plus sign on our pen tool and hover over. We have the sun selected because that's the one that's going to need to get broken up. And we're going to hover until it says intersect and click. So now where a circle normally only has 4 anchor point dots, 1, 2, 3, 4. This one actually has 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the 2 we just added, 5 and 6. So with our direct selection tool, which selects only parts of a shape, if we select these other anchor points, we can now get rid of them. But because we added additional information, whoops, go away. There we go. Because we added additional information to the shape where it intersects with those lines and added additional anchor points, then it has retained its initial shape and we just got rid of the extra. So if you look over here on the side, the path that we've created is this path right here. It's still just one single line. It didn't become the shape of the sun. It just became this one line. And again, that is exactly what we want. We don't want to build interior shapes. We only want to show where one piece of glass ends and the next piece of glass begins. So now if we pop down, Everything else looks good because we got rid of those pieces where the sun was overlapping. So there's nothing else that we need to worry about. Everything else is in good shape. We were able to use the shape builder for the outside, but we had to do a little bit of manual slicing on the inside. But we know that everything is lined up and everything looks good. At this point, we got to decide, like, hey, are we cool with our pattern? Do we like how everything looks? If you want to make changes and adjustments, this is the time to do it. And the most important thing is just to remember that any changes or adjustments that you make should have paths all aligning with each other, directly on top of one another. So looking at this, I feel like my river maybe needs a little bit of work. I think this all looks really nice at the top, but the shape of the river is a little odd, I think, now that I'm kind of seeing it on its own. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to move this up a little higher. Again, because I'm using direct selection, I'm only moving the shape of where this point is. This one's staying where it should already be aligned. And then if I grab this one over here as well, just this point, you can go ahead and try that as well. So what really helps with using the anchor points and the vector method is you can get a real visual representation of why something might look like it doesn't match up with the rest of the piece. So everything else that we have here is really smooth, symmetrical pieces, but like this piece of the river looks a little not right. And the reason why it looks not right is not because there's anything actually wrong with it, but if we look at the individual anchor points, they're not in parallel with one another. We were really specific to make sure that all of our anchor points on these paths were nice and parallel, and that gave us really smooth, pleasing looking lines. And in order to make sure that the whole piece stays cohesive, we want to make sure that that stays. So it doesn't have to be necessarily perpendicular with the horizon line, but it's going to help if these lines with each other are more parallel with one another. That's going to allow this river on its own to feel like it's a nice smooth line. So same thing over here. This one's actually pretty good. So I think that's why that one side of the river felt so much more odd than the other side. The curve here does look a little different from side to side, and that's probably because the handle length is a little different. So if we go ahead and pull them from one side to the other, we can try keeping them parallel, seeing if that gives us a good look. I think maybe this is the part where you really get to sort of play around with it a little bit to really see what's going to give you the look you're going for. I do think I want it to taper. Yeah, I think overall that's a little bit better of a shape. I think those handles better align with the overall look of the pattern, and it doesn't cut across quite so dramatically. It's a little bit smoother of an overall shape. All right, so now we're at a point where we probably want to see what it's going to look like with some color in it. We're pretty good with knowing that the actual pattern itself is trued up, it's mathematically very pleasing and correct, but it's time to start really checking on the color. So you'll notice if you look at the toolbar options, something that you'd be really familiar with in a program like Photoshop or something like Procreate or even in like PowerPoint is you'd be looking for something like a paint bucket to drop paint into these pieces. But because Illustrator is treating things as mathematical pieces of information, it won't let you paint something unless it's a closed shape. And we don't really have any closed shapes except for the big pill on the outside. We could fill that with a color, but that's the only one right now. Everything else is just an individual line segment. So that does make it a little harder to fill those pieces in. However, Illustrator does have a built-in tool that will allow you to simulate what those paint buckets would look like without actually moving away from just having a set of lines. So you're going to select all of your pieces, and what you're going to do is you're going to come up to Object, and you're going to choose Live Paint Make. So what this is going to do is temporarily, it's going to give you the option to treat this like you would in Photoshop or PowerPoint and pick up a paint color and dump it into the slots that you see visually. So the paint bucket is going to be in the same place as the shape builder tool, and it's going to say Live Paint Bucket. And from here, we can say, let's pick yellow and paint in the sun. If we open up on the side here, you can see that nothing is actually sun-shaped or filled in with yellow, but we are simulating what it's going to look like when we actually fill that piece in the center. Let's go ahead and do that with our hills. So let's do like a darker green for the back hill and a slightly lighter green for the front. We've got some blue in our river. And then for our sunbeams, let's do like orange for like every other one, and then maybe a lighter gold. Maybe a little lighter than that. Yeah, something like that. So at this point, this gives you a pretty good idea of what this is going to look like overall, but there is a step further that you can go if you want to, and that is using the Live Paint Bucket tool to simulate the actual glass that's going to go into the pieces. This flat, sort of opaque color can be good for blocking things out, but it can make it difficult to really know how this is going to look once it's made out of glass, when light is passing through it. So obviously that's a little difficult to simulate in general, but there are some ways that you can get something pretty close. So on my clipboard right now, I have this piece of green, mostly transparent glass, and you can see that it's got a lot of highs and lows in its color. It's just a photograph of it. And what we can do is we can replace this dark green on the inside with this instead. So if we open up our swatches panel, and it's going to bring up some basic colors and patterns. If we pick up this and drag over so the little blue pops up, there is now a pattern inside of the swatches panel of this dark green glass. So instead here, where this dark green was when I went to use my paint bucket tool, I had chosen a color out of here in the fill colors. Instead, I can choose from my swatches panel and I can paint in that piece of green glass. So that is going to give me the option now to really sort of see what these are going to look like with actual glass colors. So we can do a more in-depth tutorial on building swatches and swatch libraries, but just so that you know, this is the time where you can really do those simulations of what that glass color is going to look like without really making any final or solid choices that might ultimately affect how your pattern looks. You can always go back and make some changes later. The other thing that you can do at this stage is you can get an idea of what type of patina you might want to use. So we'll up the stroke a little bit here so we can get a general idea of like, yeah, that's about how thick, depending on how thick of copper foil lines you like to use. I tend to use 3/16. I know a lot of people prefer 7/32. So in general, my piece is probably going to be about that thick on its foil lines. We'll talk more about how that falls into the actual gaps between the pattern pieces, but for now, we're just in simulation mode. So I have this, if I'm looking at maybe doing a black patina, that's going to give me an idea of what a black patina would look like. However, we could also try a silver if we left it plain without doing anything to it. That would kind of give you an idea of how it's going to look. Obviously, there's going to be some variation in highs and lows in color from the reflectivity of it, but it gives you a slight idea. Or you could even try to find something that's going to give you that vaguely copper patina look, depending on how well that might work for you. So you can get a rough idea of how those different colors are going to look when you're doing things like patinas or glass colors or things like that. So if we look over at our layers panel, I'm going to close the swatches menu here, close my color menu. If we look over at our layers panel right now, you can see that it still says live paint and it shows all of the paths that are included in the live paint. If we want to hold on to this, that's totally fine. But the actual pattern that we're going to use and the piece that we're going to say either export or print out is not going to be something that looks like this. This is great for visualization. If you're planning on posting or selling patterns, this can be a really great tool for you to use, but it's not going to be very good in practice when you actually need to make the pattern itself. So if you want to hold on to this, there's no reason why you can't keep it, but remember, it's just a temporary solution. So we're going to grab this layer and we're going to make a copy of it by dragging it down to where the plus button is. And now we have 2 copies of this layer. So for this one, we're going to call this Live Paint because we like the way that that looks, especially if we had these all filled in with pictures of glass, it would be a really nice look for it. And on layer 2, we're going to go ahead and lock the Live Paint layer and turn it off. Looks the same because both layers were a copy, but now we know that we're just working with this one that says layer 2. If we come back into our Live Paint, whoops, select it, come back into our Live Paint, we're going to release it. So now it just goes back to that original pattern that we were looking at before. The stroke line is pretty thin, that's totally fine. Again, the only thing that we are interested in is knowing where one piece ends and the next piece begins. We could even get rid of this stroke altogether so that it's not visible. However, the computer still knows where it is. We're really only interested in just knowing that the line exists. We're not worried about its thickness right now. So we'll put it back up just so we can see it so we don't lose track of those lines. And I am going to name this layer Stroke Do Not Edit. I highly recommend at this point that you make a layer like this. As soon as you've determined, yes, I like the way that pattern looks, I like how all those pieces are coming together, that is my final product. Make a copy. Ensure that they are all still individual strokes that you can change the width on, that you can make them disappear and bring them back again. Call it Stroke and put Do Not Edit. And you want to lock it and say, all right, that one is set in stone. So you could also do the same thing on your Live Paint here. There's not really much you can edit on it, but you'll know that these are your locked down layers that you want to make sure are always going to be available. We have to go through the process of determining what size we're going to do these patterns at, and we need to render them out accordingly, but we never want to lose track of the original stroke files because that is how we keep this endlessly editable. We can always go back and make changes. We can always update that later. But if you accidentally do something to these layers and they're gone, you might have to start all the way from scratch again. So always make extra copies of your layers and make sure that they are locked and say to not edit them. So you hopefully won't accidentally do that. So I'm going to go ahead and make a copy of this. Do not edit. And this is the point where we're going to determine how large we want to make this piece. So originally, at the very, very beginning, we said it didn't really matter what size we made the file because we could always go back and edit it later. And that is absolutely true. So let's plan to make this sun catcher 8 inches tall. All right, so we've determined that we're going to make our sun catcher 8 inches tall. Currently, this is not 8 inches tall, or at least I don't know if it's 8 inches tall. If we go back into our properties over here, if I select this whole thing, it's going to tell me what the width and height of that project is, but it's telling it to me in pixels, which is fine, but not super helpful. So if you'd rather it tell it to you in inches, you can go to your document setup, and instead of the units being pixels, you can change it to inches. So now it'll tell you what your width and your height is. So it looks like we were actually very close and we had it at 8 inches. But if we wanted instead to change this to 6 inches or even 25 inches, anything that we want to do, we can go ahead and change the size of it. Let's go ahead and put it back to 8. So here is the part where Illustrator is so important in this process. So I have gone in here and I've said, let's make this 8 inches tall. Let's assume that you already know that someone has asked, oh, hey, can you make me a version of that is 12 inches tall? Let's go ahead and duplicate this. And we're going to make this 12 inches tall. And if I come back, I'm going to turn this one off and I have only this one selected. And I come into properties and I say height, 12 inches, you're going to see that if I turn both of these layers on at the same time, and I'm going to move this one to the side here so we can see them both. Select my whole layer, please. Thank you. You can see that right now, even though I have increased the size of the overall sun catcher, the lines have not changed. The lines are going to be whatever stroke I list in the properties here. So right now it's listed at 2-point stroke. So the point of a stroke would not show up in something like inches if you change your document setup. However, you can input this in a different unit of measure. I tend to go off of millimeters. So when you are determining how much gap there should be between your pieces of glass, we know that it is not the gap that we simulate with the solder. Like if we go back and look at our live paint, the gaps that we've simulated here account for the foil that folds over the glass having solder running along it. So that's not the gap that we're going to use when we cut the glass, because otherwise the gaps are going to be way too big. Instead, what we want to do is we want to think about what is the actual distance that needs to exist between two pieces of glass, because we want them to be as close as physically possible, but what has to be between them? We know that there's going to have to be at least 2 layers of foil and then some amount of breathing and wiggle room that just has to exist due to natural existences in the world, right? There's dust from a grinder or just general variations in a piece of glass itself. There's going to be just some amount of breathing room beyond solely just how thick the foil is. It's not always going to burnish perfectly down. There's going to be a little bit of bump there. So for me personally, I use Edco foil, which is a pretty thin foil. There are thicker foils out there. And I find that I am most successful when I, on any pattern size, whether it's this 12-inch pattern size or this 8-inch pattern size or something even teeny tiny 2 inches big, the stroke width that I want to apply to my pattern typically is going to be 0.65 millimeters. And you can see that that's pretty close to what we simulated. So I'm going to do the same thing over here. Stroke width, 0.65 millimeters. And that is going to be the size that it is. If I took this and I made it really, really, really small, you're going to see that 0.65 millimeters is changing the size of the pieces of glass on the inside, but this is staying the same distance between. Obviously, that would be absolutely tiny. That would be 1/2 inch, the size of an earring. Definitely not what we need, right? But if we put this back to our 8-inch size, it is always going to retain the same distance in between. Now, I will admit that this is kind of a trial and error part of the process. I started all the way down at the minimum, which is really just the size of 2 pieces of foil pressed up against each other. And then I added breathing room as I went on different projects until I felt that I was really getting good, consistent results. For me, that's 0.65 millimeters. If you are consistently using a thicker foil, or you don't tend to get as consistent results from your grinder, all of those different things might play into it. But I would start with somewhere around 0.65 millimeters and work up or down from there based on how your pieces are fitting. You will find that individual technique does come into it slightly, but theoretically, it should be a pretty mathematical calculation, not so much on feeling or vibes. It really should be something that's coming from a math-based assumption. So this is the reason why we did this in vector. I can continually change this over and over and over again as many times as I need to, because again, I said, do not edit this file. I just kept making copies of it. So I know that those pieces are exactly the right size. If you are just printing out your piece and that's it, you are ready to go. At this point, you can take, if it's your 12-inch one, you can go ahead and take that. You can send it to the printer and print it out as you need to. So one of the really great things about the print dialog inside of Illustrator is it already is set up to easily handle files that are larger than 8.5 by 11 inches, or whatever printer size you might be working with locally. So if you come up to File Print and you have your printer selected, you can see here that what we're working with is larger than an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And that is totally fine. We are just going to tell it that we want it to print tiled. So it's going to tile full pages. So you can see that it's showing me the size of the full artboard, but I don't need to print the whole artboard. I just need to print this one piece over here. So if you continue pushing this out, it's going to continue pushing more pieces off of your artboard. If that bothers you, you can change the size of the artboard. Here in the artboard panel, you can just push this down, and then it will not print extra pages that you might not need. So again, if we come into tile full pages, now we're only seeing these two parts. So here's the part that is really, really important. Right here where it says overlap, put this at like 0.75 inches. And now you're going to see, oh, now of course it wants to add some extra. It's totally fine. We can maybe push this over enough to get it to stop. No, it's fine. It'll print some blank pages. Okay, fine. We'll push this down to, now we're not going to get anything extra showing up. But what it will do is when it goes to print, you'll have some parts of it that are double printed. It will make it very, very easy to cut and align those pages together. So you don't have to worry about how big your pattern piece is. You don't need to use any sort of resizer programs or anything like that. The dialogue inside of Illustrator on its own is already ready to handle that. So you can print something and tile it on as many pages as you need to. If you are doing like a full window pane or anything like that, you're not going to run into any problems with that. So if you're just printing and that's everything you're doing, you're done. At this point, you are finished, you're ready to go, and you can go ahead and get started. All right, so if we're going to send this file to a Cricut machine, that's what I tend to cut my pieces out on, but you could also use a Silhouette or any other sort of cutting machine. Right now, all of these strokes are just single pieces of information about one line and where it exists, which is great because it allows us to continually adjust that stroke at any pattern size. But to send it to the Cricut, we're going to need to have a solid expanded shape. These individual lines, as we know, basically don't have any information visually. The computer knows where they are, but it doesn't show anything to us specifically. So if we put this back at 0.65 millimeters, which it'll always change back to a point stroke, but you can type it in manually as many times as you need to. What we need to do is we need to turn this individual line with this thing going down the center into a solid actual line. So we're going to grab the whole thing here and we're going to go into Object, Path, Outline Stroke. So now if we zoom in, you can see that we've got a line on the outside of each piece of the line that we've created. And you can see here there's parts where all of these are overlapping with each other. And that is exactly what we are looking for. That overlap is why we were very, very specific during the creation process to make sure that the lines were touching each other exactly, so that when we expanded the shapes, it was going to be nice and smooth and they would all be contained inside of the overlap. If there is anything that for whatever reason is not contained inside of the overlap, that is totally fine. We can go ahead and clean it up a little bit. So we'll take a look to see, I think it's just that one piece. Sometimes it just happens based on the shape of the handle from the anchor point. Sometimes it happens, it looks like here we got a little off, and that's totally fine. So what we can do is we have everything selected. If we go back into our shape builder tool that we used before, we can do the same thing we did before. We can press Alt or Option and we can just get rid of that piece that we don't want. So now it's gone. So now we have a very nice, smooth shape. However, if we look inside of all of the parts here, that's a lot of different individual paths, and that's not quite what we're looking for. We want it to be something that's nice and solid. So if we go into Pathfinder, the Unite Pathfinder up here is going to take all of those individual pieces where they overlapped, and it's just going to unite them into one solid shape. So now we have one individual compound path, which is exactly what we want. This is what we would send to the Cricut machine. However, Something important to keep in mind is knowing what the restrictions of your cutter mat is. So on a Cricut, I have a Cricut Maker. Same thing with the Cricut Explorer. That mat width is going to be 11.5 inches is the max width that you can use. So if you're making something like a 12-inch panel, this isn't going to work because you're not going to be able to send the whole shape to the Cricut at one time. It's going to be too big. So instead, you're totally fine still. We've extruded it and we know that it's the right shape and all the pieces in the middle are the right size. But instead of sending this single compound path to the Cricut, we're actually going to have to send all of the pieces. So this is the point in the process. Now that we've finally chosen our size and we've chosen the gap between our pieces, this is the time where we can actually make the glass pieces themselves. So honestly, if I don't have to do it, I won't, because the less information I have to send to the Cricut, the better. But if I'm doing something that's larger than 11.5 inches in one direction, I will have to separate it into pieces. So this is how you do that if you need to do that for whatever reason. Select your whole piece. Still in the Pathfinder, there is the one called Divide. You can see now that it has divided it into all of the individual pieces of glass. So if I turn off the initial compound path, what I am left with are all of the glass pieces. And that gap has been accounted for and is not an issue. So that is the way to do it if you're going to have to send the pieces to the Cricut, and then the Cricut will just lay them all out side by side, one by one. But ideally, if you can send it as one solid unit, that's going to be easiest. So that would be sending, instead of all of your pieces here, turn all those off. If you can send just the compound path, that works really well. Sometimes it's good to have both as an option in case, say, you break this piece while cutting and you need to cut a new piece of vinyl. It can be helpful if you only want to cut that piece instead of the whole piece. So that is how you get to the point of being able to send the file now to the Cricut. Separately, I can go through the process of how you can expand that even further and add numbers to your project so that the Cricut will both number your pieces and cut them. But at least for the intents and purposes of this tutorial, to get you from a sketch to a final pattern file that you are ready to use, this is as far as you have to go to get there. So depending on whatever you are sending out, let's go ahead and just turn everything back on again. And let's export both the outside and the inside. I'm going to go to File, Export As. We are going to export this as an SVG file. I'm going to call this Sunrise Suncatcher. And I am going to export that file. In the pieces here, go ahead and press OK. We don't have to worry about any of those specifics, but this is now ready for you to upload into Cricut, into whatever program that you have that you can take, depending on what your file type is. But these pieces are now ready for you to use as necessary, depending on if you send your cutter to cut the whole thing or send your cutter to cut the individual pieces one by one. Either will get you the same result. But again, this is only going to be for that 8-inch tall one. If we decide to go and take a look at the 12-inch tall one, we want to keep that same width. Again, 0.65 millimeters. Again, that's my personal one that has worked for me. If you have thicker foil or other considerations, you might experiment with different ones. But that will continue to allow you to modify this over and over and over again. So if we ever wanted to change this, if you open it back up, you'll find that if you change the size of this, you're no longer getting that scalability in the strokes themselves. That is why we have this stroke do not edit layer. It should never get edited. At best, you should be dragging it to the bottom to copy and continue to edit the sizing. It can also be helpful if you are trying different widths as you go, that you might say, 0.65 millimeter gap or something like that, so that you know that that was what you aimed for that to be. And you can continue to edit those as you need to. But that is the process. There is a lot that goes into it. It takes some time to get used to it, but that is how you get something that is truly editable forever. You will always have the ability to go back. You can take a look. You can always redo the live paint again. If you decide, oh, I actually don't like the way that this river looks, I want to change it again, that's totally fine. You can go ahead and make those changes. Make sure that you still have it in do not edit. You can redo and do another live paint. You always have the ability to change that and then continue to make copies of those individually and change the stroke to match the height that you've picked. So it should always be a consistent stroke length, and that won't ever affect it if you make it bigger or smaller. You'll always be able to edit it individually. So that is why being able to do something in vector is going to give you that result. So overall, there are many more tutorials that I can and probably will put together. Things about how to put those swatch panels together, more information about actually sending things to the Cricut, how to put numbers into your pattern pieces that send to the Cricut as well. All of those things together. I can do some more in depth, but here at least is a foolproof way to do it. It is a lot of information and a lot of things to keep in mind, but it will allow you to start making patterns that are truly scalable, trued up, symmetrical, pleasing, long-term success patterns that, especially when paired with the use of a Cricut or any other sort of cutting machine, is you're going to get really good, consistent results. So all the best. Please let me know if there's any more information I can help give you on this, and I am happy to continue doing more tutorials on this. But thank you so much.